I should say that kind of at least partly the inspiration for this conversation was a conversation that I had a couple of years ago with a trans client of mine who was telling me a story about how embarrassing it was to be with a group of classmates at like a restaurant and everybody's splitting the check and everybody puts their credit card down. And they were talking about how horrifying this was. And honestly, it took me a couple of minutes. Like I didn't quite get what the challenge was here, only to finally realize that oftentimes it can be damn near impossible to get a credit card with like your true name on it. Financial institutions are usually going to require you to have your dead name, and that can often out you in these type of social situations, which really got me wondering, what else don't cis people know about what life is like for trans folks? So Phoebe, I'm going to just start there. What kinds of things do you suppose cis folks have no idea about the barriers that exist for trans people right now?
Well, you take your name for granted. The first thing is first, you take your name for granted. You
Sure.
don't have to go to court, as it is in most parts of the USA, to get your name as you want it affirmed for you to use in legally recognized circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't found any state in America that doesn't require you to go to court of some description to change your name. It's different in the UK, because in the UK it's much simpler. It's one of the simplest things you can do in the UK, because you just sign a piece of paper called a deed poll, where you sign it in your current name and your previous name, and then you have two witnesses, and that's it. No need to go to court or anything, and it's free in the UK to change your name. But in America, it can be really burdensome.
Sure.
And some states require you to do a change of gender as well, and some states require you to do that as a combined document. Some states require you to do two separate documents. It's like,
and every state is making it up as they go individually and on their own.
Absolutely. It's like the state of Texas. You can do a change your name, or you can change your gender. In California, you can change your name and gender at the same time. If you go to Alaska, you can have a sealed hearing so that it's not a public hearing. In some parts of America, particularly below the Mason-Dixon line, they're public, and you have to put it in the paper that you're not evading debts, or you're not doing it for fraudulent purposes. How many people that take out a loan or something then all of a sudden go, oh, hang on, I'm a trans person, I can get rid of this loan now because they're going to change your
Right.
It's not realistic. But there's a whole plethora of things. It's like, take your social security card, for example. How many of you have thought the information that's contained behind your social security card? You have a social security card, so what information do you think is behind your social security card?
Yeah, I mean, the card itself, I couldn't say. I kind of presumed nothing. I mean, maybe a link to my social security account, but then we decided not to do private accounts. Honestly, it's messy, and it feels like it changes so much that I'm not going to pretend to be able to follow it.
So, as you know, it contains entitlement to your social security benefits. It contains things like your name and your gender or sex. And that's where we can start getting into some of the more complex issues here, because if you're applying for a job and they do a reference check based on your social security number, it can out you if you're not careful, because that can come back and say, oh, hang on, this person's name on their social security number doesn't match with the name they've given me. And that's a name for typically one sex, and this is a name for typically another sex. And sometimes it can just come back and fire back at you all the information, and it will say sex, male if it's a female presenting in front of you, or female if it's a male presenting in front of you. And it can be really challenging in some situations, because some of the things that you just take for granted, like school certificates, for example. How many of you have changed your high school diploma? Have you looked at your high school diploma and gone, yeah, that's fine? For a trans person trying to say, well, this is the high school I went to, that high school diploma can out them. Like, I have a friend of mine who has a situation where they transitioned from female to male, but they went to an all-girls school.
Oh,
so
oh, boy.
Sure.
So now it looks absurd when they put down that they went to an all-girls school if they're ever asked for their education. So what they've had to do is they've had to ask the school, can I just drop the bit that says for girls on it? And then just yeah,
Did
it's
the
just really
school
complicated.
let him do it?
The school were a bit
Somewhat reticent to
they
drop
were
the
just
4 girls.
confused, I think was the best
Sure.
thing to say. They were just confused because they didn't know what to do. It was just, as far as they were concerned, it was the name of a school. But because it had 4 girls in it, it was a problem because somebody had transitioned from female to male. And
Right.
so my friend, he had all these issues.
Wow.
Well, I mean, in so many ways, we are talking about bureaucracies that we know are going to be messy and that we know are kind of like lacking in good organization, that didn't have the forethought to plan or prepare for some of these issues. But I think it's also worth pointing out here that not only do Americans have this sort of like patchwork system that is full of all of these little cracks that things can fall into, but we also have legislatures all around the country that are kind of going out of their way to add some extra complications and to make all of this so incredibly messy. It's, I mean, whether it's incompetence and laziness or just a lack of forethought or like actual aggression, it's showing up in so many different aspects of everyday trans life. Phoebe, what else can you tell us?
So some of the other things that you may not realize is a driving license. If it's your primary form of identification. And a lot of states have different rules on how to change your driving license.
Sure.
Some states, it's very, very simple. Go to Hawaii, for example, and you can just fill out a form and you can have male, female, or an X marker on it. And in some cases, some states are slightly more surprising. Like, I've mentioned this before the show. Which state was the very first state in America to allow an X designation on a driving license?
Ooh, I know.
That
Thanks
would be
to Phoebe.
the state of,
I know.
That would be. Go on, tell the world, Nate. Tell the world.
It was Pirate, Kansas, Arkansas.
It was. So for those of you who don't believe me, it really was the state of Arkansas. And the state of Arkansas doesn't care when it comes to driving licenses. You just walk in and say, well, I want male, female, or X. And they've been doing it since 2010. Whereas if you go to some other states, they will require you to have had what they consider complete SRS, sex reassignment surgery is what they call it, to change your gender marker. I mean, the state of Michigan required this until a few years ago. It was required in another state, but a court case said that was not allowed. But if you go to the state of Georgia, it's still required to go through until you have had, if you decide to have, gender affirming surgeries. But the next question is, what is a gender affirming surgery that qualifies?
Right. I mean, that's such an arbitrary line. And I mean, in this cultural moment where we're all having these like meaningful and important, but also like problematic, I'll say, these important but problematic conversations about the role of government and what's appropriate with regards to vaccines and individual autonomy and all of these kinds of things. The fact that we have so callously and carelessly turned a blind eye to what's been experienced by such a huge population of people is just madness. The notion that you would need to have a surgical procedure in order to have your identity validated for something as simple as the opportunity to drive is just madness.
It just amazes me because a lot of people don't realize, but since 2021 and 2022, the federal government have made it easier to change documents that they have. So getting a passport now, you can now get an X designation on a passport, but you still have to go in person to change your gender on your passport. You have to book an appointment and go there with your documentation and do it in person. And it's great that they can give you an X designation on it, It's great that you can change from female to male or male to female.
Mm.
But why do you have to go in person to do it? In the UK, I just sent off the forms. Admittedly, I had to send in medical paperwork as well, but I did my passport about 10 years ago now. You don't need to send in medical paperwork to the US passport office. But why do you need to go in person? Why can't it just be done through the US Postal Service? Why does it need to be done in person? What magical extra is there from seeing somebody in person? Because it's another barrier and another inconvenience that trans people have. And the next thing that you take for granted, when was the last time you thought there was a problem with your birth certificate?
I mean, maybe 10 years ago, I had to track down an extra copy, which turned out to be a much more messy circumstance than one would hope. But in terms of a problem, I mean, everything was ready to go.
So some states in America have very difficult rules on changing your birth certificate.
Mm.
I mean, there is one state, the state of Tennessee, that says no, you cannot, full stop, change your birth certificate. No.
End of sentence. Sure.
You cannot change your birth certificate. Absolutely not. Whereas the federal government say, well, yeah, sure, you can change your consular issued record of birth. Just tell us what you want it to say. And this leads me into the argument that you have with, particularly in the UK, and it's spreading to America and other English-speaking parts of the world, about self-identification. Because the United States government allow self-identification on consular record birth certificates. And I look outside my window now and I see that the sky is still there. The moon is still, out right now. And the pharmaceutical plant near where I live is, still smelling quite bad. But there you go. The sky didn't collapse. The world didn't collapse because the federal government said, well, okay, what do you want your birth certificate to say? And it can vary so greatly between the states as to which states allow you to do what. The state of Oregon, for example, back in 2015, allowed an applicant through court to be issued with a non-binary birth certificate. And that was believed to be the first of its kind where a non-binary birth certificate was issued, and the world didn't collapse. And there needs to be this understanding that a lot of things that are taken for granted, so school certificates, driving licenses, passports, birth certificates, are real serious issues. Passports and driving licenses being the two big ones, in my opinion, because if you're traveling to certain countries that are not very friendly to the trans community, and you're having to travel on documentation that outs you, that can be incredibly dangerous.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it can also be incredibly dangerous if you're having to drive through certain states that aren't very trans friendly,
Mm-hmm.
because your state doesn't allow you to easily change your documentation. And with the introduction of real ID and enhanced driving licenses, some of these driving licenses can be used for international travel into Canada and Mexico. And that can be problematic as well if you've got somebody that's not the friendliest person at an international border going, excuse me, what's this? And it can be very frustrating when people truncate and hijack the debate and turn it into things that it's not. It's nothing to do with safety issues for the mythical person to be a victim of the mythical person. What it is about trying to get some dignity for someone. And I can speak for this for myself. The day I got my passport through, I cried the day I got my passport through. Because it said to me that the government said that I was who I said I was. When I got my new birth certificate through from the government, it was the final piece in the puzzle for me to say that I have now done everything, and everything is bang, 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 bang. It's all in place. But I shouldn't have to takes so long to do it? It shouldn't be this difficult. There shouldn't be this patchwork quilt of 55, 56 different ways of doing it. Because you've got to remember, you've got the District of Columbia that does it differently, to
Sure.
the Virgin Islands that do it differently, to Guam, to Alaska, to the federal government itself. It's all a potluck of where you were born if you want to change your birth certificate. It's all a potluck of where you live if you want to change your driving license. And it really, really shouldn't be this way. Because why should somebody who lives in Illinois be able to get an X designation on their driving license, whereas somebody who lives in Missouri can't get an X designation on their driving license? Why is it in the third decade of the 21st century that this is what the debate still is?
Oh, because the America elected a crazed con man, former game show host turned politician as president. I've been
You're
wanting
telling me
to
something about
pop
Joe
in with
Biden I
this.
didn't know.
I wanted to pop in with this question a little earlier, but Christy, you're an American.
Sure.
To what degree do you think that this rash of anti-trans legislation and some of the things Phoebe was talking about, do you think that some of these legislators in these some of the less progressive states feel emboldened by the bigotry they saw from the most senior office in the land?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there are certainly folks more qualified to comment on the political backlash that we're experiencing right now, but
Mhm.
it doesn't take a degree in political science to recognize that, Obama led to Trump in a lot of ways, and that in the early 2010s, we start to see a lot more trans representation on television. And, it may sound like cheesy to cast too big of a spotlight on this, but, folks like shows like Orange is the New Black and the very public experiences of Caitlyn Jenner and some of these names, love them or hate them, were really starting to change the dialogue. And we were starting to see really meaningful change in trans
Yeah.
acceptance.
Yeah.
And there's a huge backlash against that. I mean, these laws that are being considered in so many legislatures right now would have been unthinkable 10 years ago because nobody was concerned about the problem. But we needed somebody to be angry at, and we started pointing that vitriol, in particular at trans folks, in a number of ways. And it's a way to get reelected. It's a way to sort of affirm your adherence to a very specific set of ideals, those ideals being oftentimes based on a rather misguided and not particularly studious understanding of very ancient Jewish poetry. Why that's a system of governance, I don't know, but that's honestly what we're looking at in a lot of different ways here.
Yeah, I've said this before on the show, but it's kind of a case of, well, let me interrupt your evidence with my confidence here.
Yeah, for real.
What do you think, Phoebe? Is it?
I think that what it has done is that people have seen that certain things have existed for a long time. In California, for example, since 2008, they have allowed athletes who are trans to compete in the identity that they identify with.
Mm-hmm.
Use identity a lot in that sentence. But now you have Pennsylvania, and it's a global issue for some reason that a swimmer is swimming in a swimming competition at college.
Mm-hmm.
Why this is a global issue is beyond any comprehension that I would have ever believed. And it does come down to what I have seen a number of people, particularly in my friend circle, say it is just recycled homophobia.
Sure.
And it's that
Yeah.
recycling of the othering, the fear, the you are a predator, the you are a nasty person, the you are stealing the spotlight, you are here asking for more rights. Whereas if you look back at what was being said about homosexual, particularly homosexual men in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and even in the 1990s.
Oh, I remember those days, and it does seem like it's a lot of the same old rehashed bullshit. It really is. It's just, oh, the fabric of society and think of the children. And then you've
No
got
doubt.
people like Abigail Schreier out there writing books about the epidemic of trans girls being fooled into thinking they're boys. Like that's not a thing. Like Phoebe was saying, no trans person has ever tried to transition to get out of alone or to be cool with their social group. Like you're literally signing up for one of the most, maligned social groups that exist. Like nobody would do that for there's so many.
Yeah.
It's
Well, I mean,
ridiculous.
I'll let the audience draw their own inferences, but I mean, in this moment where America is considering voting rights and looking at the different obstacles that are necessary in order to preserve the integrity of the ballot and all of these different barriers that are being constructed totally for absolutely no reason other than to protect the safety of the ballot. I'm very clear that so many of these rules, these restrictions, are not about preventing people from evading debts. They're not about preventing people from, sneaking around and changing their identity in these ways. But I guess I should at least ask Phoebe, is there any validity to why these bureaucracies are necessary? I mean, is it just the case that it hasn't been sufficiently streamlined, or that it is difficult because we just haven't invested the right resources, or is this just out and out bigotry?
That was my question, kind of. Yeah.
The reason the bureaucracies exist in the first place is because when, say, 30, 40 years ago, they were seen as special cases, one-off cases. Here, we're going to have to change the rules slightly just for you. But now it's becoming wider and more accepted. We have to do everything as a one-off special case, no matter what, has stayed for everything. And it's taking courts, it's taking legislators to go to administrators and to say to some lower judges, excuse me, this is not abnormal anymore. It's something which is becoming more commonplace, something which is becoming more widespread. And excuse me, you're going to back your court system up. You're going to back your administration system up to buggery and back.
Sure.
Just because you haven't modernized. That's where it started from. But what you do have is deliberate resistance to it. It reminds me after the Obergefell versus Hodges case, which legalized gay marriage, and then you had the Kansas woman who refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. It's the same thing. Someone is pushing forward to say, yes, that's fine. And then you have people push back and say, no, I'd rather go to prison. Which they did send her to prison over it in the end.
Kim Davises of the world
That's
step up.
the world.
Yeah, so I remember.
Kim Davis. And
she lost her job, I believe. She didn't get reelected.
She lost her job and...
I mean, but I don't doubt that we live in a world where she has plenty of opportunities after being, made a famous name for that transphobia or homophobia, which, these bigotries are certainly all connected. I mean, it's definitely the majority versus, and we're always looking for something. But I guess before we jump on the phones, Phoebe, I wanted to spend at least a little bit of time kind of elucidating like what some of these barriers and burdens are. We've talked a little bit about like legal documentation and some of the challenges there. I think it probably goes without saying that if you have trouble getting these records, or even if you do get them changed because of the way that your past documents follow you, I imagine that in a lot of places when you are applying for a job, some of the your dead name and a lot of these other things are coming up. What can you tell us about some of the particulars there?
So some of the big particulars when I was starting my transition, and I started my transition over 10 years ago for the second time, was I had applied for a seasonal job at a large clothing retailer near me. And I wanted to apply to them again. But I couldn't apply to them again because it would have meant that I had to give my same national insurance number to them, which is the UK equivalent of a social security number,
Sure.
and it would have said to them I was Mr. Blah Blah Blah, who was worker from last year. So it stopped me from getting that job entirely because in the UK you can't change your national insurance number unless you change certain other things to go with it. But that doesn't matter because their records would have said, well, hang on, you're this person on our records with this
Right.
national insurance number. So I couldn't apply for that job that I had done on a seasonal basis the year before. And other things, it can mean that you're less willing or less able to actually travel overseas because you may not want to go through an international airport with a passport that's in the incorrect name. And that can be very challenging. It can also be very challenging when you're trying to do certain things like get a library card. Because a library card requires you to have photo ID. So you can't access a library until you've changed these things. And what it all boils down to is money. If you're a wealthy person, it's easier for you because you can just pay the fee.
Sure.
And you can just do it.
Or have a lawyer, have an assistant, have opportunity and access to a lot of these things that might involve, having a lot of court dates, filling out a lot of forms, like standing in line.
Yeah. And it's not easy, some of these forms. Some of these forms are really, really complicated. It's like for me to get a new birth certificate in the UK, I had to fill out an 18-page form, get two reports from two different doctors, one saying that I had been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, one saying that I was currently receiving certain medications. I had to go and get a statutory declaration done, signed by my solicitor, and then I had to send it off to a court that I wasn't allowed to go to, that was all closed hearings, and they just send back saying yes or no. And the first time they said no, and the second time they said yes, and the second time I submitted the same documents that I had the first time. So
Fantastic.
It can just be arbitrary as to whether you get an update or not.
Sure.
And it's this arbitrary nature of things that is the most frustrating, because sometimes you can go and it can be no problem. So if you're going to, like in the example that you mentioned at the start, Christy, with going out for a night out, some credit card companies, they'll just give you a new credit card. Just apply for it, fine. And you can go out and you can be fine and you've got no worries at all. Some of them, they would just say, nah, get on your bike.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's a wild patchwork of garbage.